the shadowed corridors of Vienna's imperial palace, where gilded mirrors reflected centuries of power and privilege, a secret festered behind marble walls and silk curtains. The year was 1793, and the Habsburg dynasty stood at the pinnacle of European dominance, their empire stretching across continents, their bloodline considered sacred by divine right. But on a cold April morning, as church bells echoed through the Austrian capital, that same bloodline would deliver its most devastating verdict yet. The cries of labour had finally ceased in the royal birthing chamber. Physicians in their finest coats waited with bated breath as attendants lifted a newborn prince into the flickering candlelight. This child was meant to secure the future of an empire that had ruled for centuries, a dynasty whose marriages had been calculated like chess moves across the courts of Europe. Yet, as the infant drew his first breath, something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. His skull bulged unnaturally where bone should have fused. His tiny limbs trembled with each labored breath. When his eyes opened, they drifted without focus or recognition. The silence that followed was deafening. No triumphant cry, no celebration, just the horrifying realization that generations of political ambition had finally reached their biological breaking point. The future Emperor Ferdinand of Austria had been born, but nature itself seemed to be rejecting what centuries of inbreeding had created. What the court physicians witnessed that day was not merely a difficult birth or temporary weakness. It was evidence of something far more sinister brewing within the Habsburg bloodline. For over 200 years, the royal family had followed a simple yet catastrophic motto: let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces as wives, and the family tree had long since stopped branching outward. Instead, it coiled inward like a serpent devouring its own tail, each generation more genetically compromised than the last. Modern science would later reveal the true horror of what the Habsburgs had done to themselves. Their inbreeding coefficient had reached levels that nature simply could not tolerate. The same chromosomes circled endlessly through their lineage, carrying with them recessive mutations that accumulated like poison in a sealed well. What they called dynastic prudence, genetics would call catastrophic collapse. Ferdinand's mother, the Archduchess Maria Theresa, stared down at her newborn son with a mixture of love and dread. She understood better than most the curse that ran through Habsburg veins. She was both niece and cousin to her own husband, Emperor Francis II. The child in her arms was not just her son, he was the living echo of centuries of genetic repetition, a biological monument to royal arrogance. From his earliest days, Ferdinand's body bore witness to the price of purity. Court records describe an infant who suffered prolonged seizures that left him rigid and blue. His skull sutures had closed prematurely, causing his head to swell in grotesque proportions. Milk dribbled constantly from the corners of his mouth as his tongue and lips failed to coordinate. Nurses reported that he would stare at the ornate ceiling frescoes for hours without blinking, then suddenly convulse so violently that his cradle would shake across the marble floor. The royal physicians, men trained in the finest medical colleges of Europe, found themselves utterly helpless. They prescribed mercury and leeches, burned sulfur and feathers to drive away evil spirits, sprinkled holy water blessed by the Pope himself. Nothing worked. The devil they were fighting lived not in the supernatural realm, but in Ferdinand's very chromosomes. Each cell in his body carried the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of genetic compromise. By the age of 4, when most children are running and playing, Ferdinand could barely stand. His legs bowed under his small frame, his feet turned inward, and servants had to carry him from room to room like they once carried the Spanish Habsburg King Charles II. The resemblance was not coincidental. Both boys were living warnings that bloodlines too pure become poison, that royal blood concentrated beyond nature's limits transforms into something monstrous. Speech came slowly and broken. Words emerged from Ferdinand's mouth fractured and slurred, as though his tongue were too heavy for proper articulation. Court tutors learned to interpret his murmurings like translating an infant's cries. The imperial painters would later soften his portraits, showing a composed young prince with intelligent eyes. The reality was far more disturbing. He could barely form a complete sentence without assistance, and his constant drooling required attendants to keep silk cloths at the ready. The seizures that had begun in infancy only intensified as Ferdinand grew. What the court called holy attacks were actually grand mal epileptic fits that left him temporarily paralyzed, confused, and sometimes incontinent. During these episodes, foam would pour from his mouth. His eyes would roll back until only the whites showed, and his entire body would convulse with such violence that multiple attendants were needed to prevent him from injuring himself against the furniture. As Ferdinand entered adolescence, his physical deformities became impossible to hide. His head remained disproportionately large. His lower jaw jutted forward in a pale echo of the ancestral Habsburg chin, and his teeth never properly aligned. Eating became a daily ordeal. Court chefs learned to soften meat in broth and soak bread in wine. During formal banquets, an attendant would discreetly wipe saliva from his chin, while foreign dignitaries pretended not to notice the boy's growth had essentially stopped. At 15, his height froze at barely 5 feet. His shoulders remained narrow, his limbs thin and weak, his skin almost translucent. Puberty brought no changes. His voice never deepened. His body remained childlike, and court physicians privately suspected complete endocrine failure. The same pituitary collapse that modern geneticists would later identify in other victims of severe inbreeding. Yet the empire demanded continuity. Marriage plans were drawn up, alliance negotiations began, and the fiction of royal normalcy continued. How do you marry off a prince who can barely stand, whose mind drifts in and out of coherence like morning fog? The answer, as it had been for generations, was careful choreography and willful blindness. Ferdinand's first public seizure occurred during a mass at the Hofburg Chapel, when he was 19 years old. As horrified nobles looked on, the heir to the Austrian throne stiffened, his eyes rolling back, his limbs thrashing uncontrollably against the marble floor. When consciousness finally returned, his first words were an apology to God for interrupting the sermon. The spectacle cemented his reputation as something between a saint and an invalid, the suffering prince who bore the sins of his house. Behind the palace walls, the truth was becoming impossible to deny. Ferdinand's intellect would never mature beyond that of a child. He could memorize prayers, but not understand state documents. He could mimic court etiquette, but never grasp the complexities of governance. Ministers began quietly preparing for a reign that would be nothing more than an elaborate puppet show, with the real power resting in the hands of advisors and regents. The Habsburg Empire, which had once dominated half of Europe through strategic marriages and political cunning, now faced its greatest challenge. Not foreign armies or revolutionary uprisings, but the biological consequences of their own genetic hubris. In Ferdinand, centuries of calculated breeding had produced not a superman, but a broken child, trapped in a man's crown. The empire's greatest secret was not hidden in underground vaults or encrypted documents, but seated at its own dinner table. The future Emperor of Austria was a living monument to the price of purity, a testament to what happens when human arrogance attempts to improve upon nature's design. As Ferdinand approached his 20s, the palace had essentially become a gilded asylum, with an empire's worth of attendants, physicians, and priests, whispering constant reassurances to a prince whose body rejected its own commands. Outside, the world was changing rapidly, with revolutions brewing and new ideologies challenging the old order. But inside the Hofburg Palace, time had congealed around a future emperor who would never truly rule, never father an heir, and never escape the genetic prison built by his ancestors' ambitions. The stage was set for one of history's most tragic reigns, where the crown of Austria would rest upon a head filled not with wisdom or cunning, but with the accumulated fluid of centuries of biological compromise. Ferdinand's story was just beginning, and it would serve as the final, devastating chapter in the Habsburg dynasty's long experiment with genetic purity. When Ferdinand finally ascended to the throne in 1835, at the age of 42, the coronation ceremony became a masterpiece of imperial theatre designed to mask biological catastrophe. The ancient crown of Austria, heavy with centuries of tradition, was placed upon a skull that bulged with accumulated fluid, while thousands of subjects cheered for an emperor whose trembling hands could barely hold the ceremonial scepter. The irony was suffocating. Here was a man who ruled over 40 million souls across a dozen kingdoms, yet couldn't rule over his own nervous system. The Habsburg motto, "Austria is destined to rule the world," had never sounded more hollow than when spoken by lips that drooled constantly and struggled to form coherent syllables. Behind the glittering facade of imperial power, Ferdinand's daily existence had devolved into something resembling a medical nightmare wrapped in silk and gold. His seizures had evolved beyond mere inconvenience into full neurological catastrophes that could strike without warning. Court physicians documented episodes where the emperor would freeze mid-sentence during meetings, his eyes glazing over as his consciousness simply vanished for minutes at a time. The marriage arranged for Ferdinand proved to be yet another cruel joke played by genetics upon royalty. Princess Maria Anna of Savoy arrived in Vienna expecting to become the mother of future emperors, but what she found was a husband whose body had been so thoroughly corrupted by inbreeding that consummation was physically impossible. The wedding night became a whispered scandal that rippled through European courts for decades. Servants spoke in hushed tones of hearing, sobbing from the imperial bedchamber, followed by the urgent summoning of physicians. The verdict, though never officially recorded, was devastatingly clear. Ferdinand's reproductive organs had withered to the size of a child's, calcified and utterly non-functional. The dynasty that had spent centuries carefully preserving its bloodline had produced an emperor who couldn't produce blood heirs. The palace response was predictably theatrical. Holy relics were smuggled into the emperor's bedroom under cover of darkness. He slept clutching rosary beads while his wife wept beside him. Exorcists whispered prayers over his convulsing form during seizures, sprinkling blessed water that did nothing to calm the electrical storms raging through his brain. A piece of St. Leopold's bone was even placed beneath his pillow, as if divine intervention could repair what centuries of genetic abuse had destroyed. Ferdinand's mental capacity continued its relentless decline. He became obsessed with children's toys, particularly toy soldiers that he would arrange in elaborate battle formations across his desk. The emperor, who commanded real armies across Europe, spent his afternoons feeding breadcrumbs to miniature cavalry and weeping when he couldn't reassemble the clockwork mechanisms he'd taken apart during sleepless nights. His speech deteriorated into something barely recognizable as human language. Words slurred together into incomprehensible strings of syllables, punctuated by sudden bursts of Latin prayers memorized in childhood. Foreign diplomats left audiences with Ferdinand, describing experiences that felt more like seances than state meetings. The emperor would nod solemnly at reports he couldn't possibly understand, occasionally shouting single phrases repeatedly without context or explanation. The physical transformation was equally horrifying. Ferdinand's face began to sag asymmetrically as minor strokes damaged the delicate neural networks controlling his facial muscles. His right eyelid drooped permanently, giving him a perpetually sleepy appearance that masked the neurological chaos beneath his left arm. Developed an involuntary tremor that made simple tasks, like signing documents, an ordeal requiring multiple attendants to guide his hand. Court painters faced an impossible challenge. How do you create inspiring portraits of an emperor whose appearance grew more disturbing by the month? They resorted to painting from memory of better days, or simply from imagination. creating idealized images that bore little resemblance to the trembling figure propped up in the palace throne room. The empire's business continued, but only through an elaborate network of substitutions and forgeries. Prince Metternich, the brilliant foreign minister, became Austria's true ruler, while Ferdinand's signature was forged on documents months after he'd last been lucid enough to read them. The puppet show reached absurd proportions when ministers began scheduling meetings around the emperor's seizure patterns, timing important decisions for the brief windows when his consciousness flickered back to something resembling awareness. Ferdinand's digestive system joined the rebellion against his body's continued existence. The anti-convulsant medications, loaded with mercury and arsenic, poisoned his stomach lining until even the simplest foods became sources of agony. His meals were reduced to thin gruels that his wife would feed him with a spoon, while servants pretended not to witness the degradation of imperial dignity. The emperor's relationship with reality became increasingly tenuous. He began mistaking courtiers for dead relatives, addressing his wife as his mother, and holding lengthy conversations with people who existed only in his damaged memory. Palace guards grew accustomed to finding him wandering the corridors in his nightshirt, weeping before blank walls and crossing himself repeatedly while mumbling prayers to saints who had never existed. By the 1840s, Ferdinand had become a living ghost haunting his own palace. His weight plummeted as his throat muscles weakened, making swallowing a dangerous ordeal that often ended in choking fits that turned his lips blue. His hair fell out in clumps, his skin took on a waxy yellow pallor, and his eyes lost their focus entirely, staring at some invisible horizon beyond the physical world. The seizures evolved into something resembling medieval descriptions of demonic possession. Ferdinand's body would arch backward in impossible positions, his limbs contorting as electrical chaos raged through his nervous system. Foam would pour from his mouth, sometimes tinged with blood from his bitten tongue, while his breathing became so labored that physicians feared each episode might be his last court records from this period, read like medical horror stories disguised as royal chronicles. Attendants documented nights when Ferdinand would scream for hours, his voice echoing through the palace corridors as waves of pain crashed through his skull. The pressure building inside his cranium from accumulated cerebrospinal fluid created headaches so intense that he would bang his head against marble walls until restrained. The revolution of 1848 found Ferdinand completely oblivious to the chaos erupting beyond his palace walls. While mobs stormed through Vienna's streets demanding political change, the emperor sat in his private chapel, clutching a crucifix and muttering childhood lullabies. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. The people were rising up against an empire ruled by a man who couldn't rule his own bladder, much less a nation. Ferdinand's abdication on December 2nd, 1848, was presented as a noble gesture of stepping aside for the next generation. The reality was far more prosaic. The emperor had become such a liability that even maintaining the pretense of his rule threatened the dynasty's survival. His nephew Franz Joseph would inherit the throne, but Ferdinand would retain his titles and imperial dignity in comfortable exile. The former emperor was quietly moved to Prague Castle, where his final decades would unfold like a slow-motion medical catastrophe observed by a handful of loyal attendants. The man who had once been crowned in Vienna's grandest cathedral would spend his remaining years arranging toy soldiers and asking visitors whether the bells had rung for mass, his mind trapped in an endless loop of childhood memories and religious ritual. Prague became Ferdinand's gilded prison, where the consequences of Habsburg genetic experimentation would play out to their inevitable conclusion. The castle's medical staff prepared for what they knew would be a prolonged death, as Ferdinand's body continued its systematic breakdown with the methodical precision of a biological clock winding down. The Prague years began with Ferdinand shuffling through corridors that had once echoed with the footsteps of kings, but now served as a mausoleum for living royalty. His attendants had grown skilled at interpreting the subtle signs that preceded his attacks. The metallic taste that made him clutch his mouth in terror, the sudden stillness that overtook his trembling limbs, the glassy stare that meant consciousness was about to abandon him entirely. Each seizure stripped away another fragment of the man he had never quite been. His vocabulary shrank to a handful of words, mostly prayers learned in childhood and the names of saints who might intercede on his behalf. The elaborate court etiquette that had once governed his every gesture dissolved into reflexive crossing himself and bowing to empty air. Palace staff learned to work around his episodes like choreographed dancers, catching him when he fell, wiping the foam from his lips, and pretending not to notice when he soiled himself. The former emperor's daily routine became a series of small medical emergencies punctuated by moments of heartbreaking lucidity. He would wake at dawn, often confused about where he was or what year it was, calling for attendants who had died decades earlier. His breakfast consisted of thin porridge that had to be fed to him spoonful by spoonful, as his throat muscles had weakened to the point where swallowing required conscious effort. More often than not, he would choke and vomit, his body rejecting even the most basic sustenance. His wife Maria Anna had become something between a nurse and a mourner, tending to a husband who no longer recognized her face, but still smiled when she sang the lullabies he remembered from childhood. She would spend hours cutting his fingernails, which had grown thick and yellow, and massaging his limbs to prevent the muscle atrophy that was claiming him inch by inch. Her private letters described watching her husband disappear piece by piece, as if death were taking him on the installment plan. The physical deterioration accelerated with each passing year. Ferdinand's spine curved into a permanent hunch as his bones softened from decades of medication toxicity. His joints locked in painful positions, forcing him to shuffle rather than walk. His skin became so thin that the slightest bump would tear it open, leaving wounds that refused to heal. The castle's medical staff applied poultices and bandages that seemed to multiply daily, until Ferdinand resembled a living mummy wrapped in linen and smelling of medicinal herbs. His breathing grew labored as his chest muscles weakened, each inhalation a visible struggle that rattled through his throat like wind through broken windows. Chronic pneumonia became a permanent resident in his lungs, treated with steam tents and hot poultices that provided temporary relief, but no lasting cure. The sound of his coughing echoed through Prague Castle at all hours, a rhythmic reminder that the former emperor was drowning in his own bodily fluids. The seizures evolved into something beyond medical description. Ferdinand's body would contort into positions that seemed to defy human anatomy, his spine arching backward until attendants feared it might snap. His eyes would roll so far back that only the whites showed, while his limbs thrashed with such violence that they had to pad his room with thick carpets and cushions. The electrical storms in his brain had become so frequent that consciousness itself became a rare and precious commodity. Between attacks, Ferdinand existed in a twilight state that was neither fully awake nor properly asleep. He would sit motionless for hours, staring at patterns in the wallpaper that only he could see, occasionally reaching out to touch invisible objects or speaking to people who had been dead for years. His attendants documented conversations where he argued with his long-deceased father about state policies, or pleaded with his mother to let him come home from a boarding school he had never attended. The toy soldiers that had fascinated him for decades became his primary companions in these final years. He would arrange them in elaborate formations across his desk, narrating battles that existed only in his damaged imagination. Sometimes he would weep when pieces broke, mourning these miniature casualties with the grief of a general who had lost real armies. The irony was not lost on his caretakers that the man who had once commanded actual regiments now found his greatest joy in commanding toys. Food became an increasingly complex challenge as Ferdinand's digestive system joined the comprehensive rebellion of his body. His stomach could no longer process solid foods, requiring everything to be pured into thin liquids that barely qualified as nourishment, Even these simple meals often triggered violent retching that left him exhausted and dehydrated. His weight plummeted until his clothes hung on him like fabric draped over a scarecrow, and his attendants had to pad his chairs to prevent bed sores from his protruding bones. The former emperor's sleep patterns disintegrated entirely. He would doze fitfully during the day, then spend nights wandering his chambers in confusion, calling out for help with problems that existed only in his fractured memory. Palace guards grew accustomed to hearing him recite Latin prayers at 3 a.m, his voice cracking with emotion as he begged God for forgiveness for sins he couldn't remember committing. His hair, once carefully groomed and powdered according to court fashion, fell out in patches until only wisps remained clinging to his spotted scalp. His scalp itself had become a topographical map of bumps and indentations where the accumulated cerebrospinal fluid had reshaped his skull over decades. Touching his head felt like pressing on a balloon filled with water, soft and yielding in ways that human bone should never be. The medical treatments grew more desperate as conventional remedies proved useless against his comprehensive decline. Physicians attempted bleeding him with leeches, shocking him with primitive electrical devices, and even drilling small holes in his skull to relieve the pressure building inside his cranium. Each intervention seemed to accelerate rather than slow his deterioration, as if his body had reached a point where any disturbance triggered further collapse. Ferdinand's eyesight began to fail as the pressure in his skull compressed his optic nerves. He would reach for objects that weren't there, stumble over furniture he couldn't see, and stare directly at people while asking if anyone was in the room. His world shrank to the few feet immediately around his chair, and even that limited space became populated with hallucinations that were more real to him than the actual people trying to care for him. His speech deteriorated into something resembling the babbling of an infant, though occasionally complete sentences would emerge with startling clarity, as if his damaged brain were a broken radio that sometimes caught a clear signal. These moments of lucidity were devastating in their brevity, offering glimpses of the man trapped inside the biological wreckage before consciousness faded back into confusion. The seizures began lasting longer and leaving him more damaged each time. What had once been brief interruptions to his day became prolonged battles between his nervous system and his will to survive. Attendants timed the episodes, noting with growing alarm that recovery took longer after each attack. His body was like a machine whose parts were wearing out faster than they could be repaired, and everyone understood that eventually one of these electrical storms would be the last. By the early 1870s, Ferdinand existed in a state that challenged the very definition of life he could no longer speak, eat solid food, or recognize the faces of people who had cared for him for decades. His body had become a collection of failing systems held together by medical intervention and stubborn biological momentum. The man who had once worn the crown of Austria had been reduced to a breathing testament to the horrors that await bloodlines too proud to accept genetic diversity. The Prague castle's medical staff prepared for what they knew would be an inevitable conclusion. Ferdinand's body had absorbed all the punishment that centuries of inbreeding could inflict, and the biological bill was finally coming due. The former emperor's final chapter was being written in medical charts that documented the systematic failure of every organ system as the Habsburg genetic experiment reached its logical and terrifying conclusion. The summer of 1875 brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to settle over Prague Castle like a burial shroud. Ferdinand's chambers, once grand apartments befitting an emperor, had been transformed into something resembling a medieval sick ward. The windows remained shuttered against the light that now caused him excruciating pain, while the air grew thick with the smell of medicinal compounds and human decay. His attendants moved like ghosts through the darkened rooms, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that absorbed both sound and the constant spillage from his failing body. The former emperor's condition had deteriorated beyond what medical science of the era could comprehend or treat. His seizures now came in clusters, waves of neurological chaos that would crash over him for hours at a time. Between these episodes, he existed in a twilight realm where consciousness flickered like a dying candle. The accumulated cerebrospinal fluid in his skull had reached dangerous levels, creating a grotesque swelling that made his head appear almost balloon-like. When touched, it felt soft and yielding, as though his very skull had become liquid. Dr. Mannheim, the castle's chief physician, documented these final months with clinical detachment that barely masked his horror. The emperor's brain, he noted, seemed to be drowning in its own fluids. The pressure had compressed vital neural pathways until basic functions like swallowing and breathing required conscious effort that Ferdinand could no longer consistently muster. His tongue had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, making speech impossible, and eating a constant choking hazard. The physical transformation was complete and devastating. Ferdinand's body weight had plummeted to less than 90 pounds, his frame so wasted that his bones were visible beneath skin that had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. His limbs had contracted into permanent fetal positions, joints locked by decades of seizure damage and muscular atrophy. Moving him required 3 attendants working in careful coordination. As his bones had become so brittle that the slightest pressure could cause fractures, his digestive system had essentially shut down, rejecting even the thinnest broths and requiring nourishment to be administered drop by drop through a silver tube inserted into his throat. The chronic diarrhea that had plagued him for years had given way to complete bowel paralysis, necessitating increasingly invasive medical interventions that added to his suffering without providing relief. The royal physicians had exhausted their arsenal of treatments, reduced to administering morphine in doses that would have killed a healthy man but barely dulled Ferdinand's constant agony. The seizures themselves had evolved into something that defied medical categorization. They would begin with a peculiar stillness, as though Ferdinand's entire nervous system were holding its breath. Then the convulsions would start, not the violent thrashing of his earlier years, but a more sinister writhing that seemed to emanate from deep within his core. His eyes would remain open throughout these episodes, staring with an awareness that was somehow more terrifying than unconsciousness would have been. During lucid moments, which became increasingly rare, Ferdinand would whisper fragments of prayers in a voice so weak that attendants had to lean close to hear him. The words were often jumbled, Latin phrases mixed with childhood nursery rhymes and the names of long-dead relatives. Sometimes he would ask for his mother, dead now for 30 years, or beg to go home to a palace he would never see again. These glimpses of awareness were heartbreaking in their clarity, brief windows into a mind that understood its own dissolution. The castle's medical staff had begun preparing for the inevitable with the methodical precision of undertakers. Special linens were ordered, embalming supplies discreetly procured, and arrangements made for the complex procedures that would follow an imperial death. The autopsy, they knew, would be crucial for understanding what had destroyed the last viable Habsburg heir, though they suspected the findings would be too horrifying for public consumption. Ferdinand's wife, Maria Anna, had aged decades in the space of months, her vigil beside his deathbed transforming her from a middle-aged empress into an elderly widow before widowhood had even arrived. She spent her days reading to him from prayer books, though whether he could still comprehend the words remained unclear. Her letters to relatives described watching her husband's personality disappear piece by piece, as if death were performing a slow-motion dissection of his soul. The former emperor's breathing had become increasingly laboured, each inhalation a visible struggle that sent ripples across the fluid-filled cavities of his skull. His chest would rise and fall irregularly, sometimes pausing for so long that attendants feared he had expired, only to resume with a gasping sound that echoed through the chamber like wind through a broken organ pipe. The sound haunted the castle's corridors, a constant reminder that imperial dignity could not protect against biological collapse. His skin had developed a peculiar mottled pattern, patches of purple and yellow that shifted and changed as his circulation failed. Bedsores had opened across his body despite constant attention, weeping wounds that refused to heal. and attracted flies despite the sealed windows. The smell had become so overwhelming that attendants worked in shifts, unable to endure prolonged exposure to the sweet, sick odor of living decay that surrounded the former emperor's bed. The toy soldiers that had been his companions for so many years now lay scattered and forgotten across his desk, their miniature battles no longer capable of capturing his fading attention. In their place, religious artifacts filled his chamber. Crucifixes, holy relics, and blessed medallions that offered spiritual comfort, while providing no relief from physical suffering. Priests took turns maintaining a constant vigil, their Latin chants mixing with Ferdinand's laboured breathing to create a soundtrack of impending death. Dr. Mannheim's final medical entries read like dispatches from a biological battlefield. The patient's nervous system was shutting down in systematic stages, each day bringing new symptoms, as different regions of his brain succumbed to pressure and toxicity. His pupils no longer responded to light. His reflexes had vanished entirely, and his body temperature fluctuated wildly as his hypothalamus lost its ability to regulate basic functions. The end, when it finally came, arrived with the gradual inevitability of a sunset. Ferdinand's breathing grew shallower throughout the night of June 28th, each breath requiring more effort than his exhausted body could sustain. His attendants maintained their vigil, holding his hands and whispering prayers as his pulse grew weaker and more irregular. There were no final words, no last requests, just the slow cessation of biological processes that had been failing for decades. At 3:17 in the morning on June 29th, 1875, Ferdinand I of Austria drew his final breath. His death was recorded as natural causes, though the physicians who had witnessed his decline understood that nothing about his condition had been natural. The Habsburg experiment in genetic purity had finally reached its logical conclusion. The accumulated damage of centuries of inbreeding expressed in the systematic failure of every organ system in his body. The autopsy that followed revealed horrors that confirmed the physician's worst fears. Ferdinand's brain had shrunk to 2/3 its normal size, floating in an ocean of cerebrospinal fluid that had compressed it beyond recognition. The tissue itself was riddled with lesions and scars from decades of epileptic damage, while the ventricles had expanded so dramatically that they occupied most of the cranial cavity. The cerebellum, responsible for coordination and balance, had deteriorated to the point where it crumbled under the pathologist's scalpel. His other organs told the same story of comprehensive biological failure. The heart was severely enlarged and scarred, its valves calcified and barely functional. The lungs were filled with fluid and showed signs of chronic infection that had persisted for months. The liver was discolored and fibrous, damaged beyond repair by decades of toxic medications. Most disturbing of all were his reproductive organs, which had atrophied to the point where they resembled those of a prepubescent child rather than a grown man. The skeleton itself bore witness to the genetic catastrophe that had shaped Ferdinand's life. His skull showed signs of premature suture closure that had forced his brain to grow in abnormal patterns. The spine was severely curved, the bones porous and weak from metabolic disorders caused by his compromised genetics. Even his teeth, those final markers of Habsburg identity, were malformed and had fallen out years before his death. The pathologist's report, written in the careful Latin that medical men used to distance themselves from horror, documented abnormalities that challenged their understanding of human biology. Ferdinand's body was a catalogue of genetic disorders, each one a consequence of the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity. The man who had worn the crown of Austria had been destroyed not by enemies or disease, but by the accumulated weight of his own ancestry. Ferdinand's burial in the imperial crypt marked the end of more than just a life. It signaled the biological bankruptcy of a dynasty that had ruled Europe for centuries. The marble tomb that sealed his remains also entombed the dark truth of what happens when human arrogance attempts to perfect what nature has already designed. The Habsburg experiment in genetic purity had produced not gods among men, but a succession of broken souls trapped in failing bodies, culminating in an emperor whose skull held more water than wisdom. Today, as we gaze upon those pristine royal portraits in museums worldwide, we should remember Ferdinand. The trembling hands, the seizure-racked body, the mind that never fully formed. His story stands as history's most devastating reminder that some prices are too terrible to pay, even for a crown.